History doesn't always happen in the places you'd expect. It happens in the small towns, the back rooms, the forgotten corners, in the lives of people whose names never made it into the textbooks. People who shaped the world anyway, from towns you've probably never heard of, the unsung, the overlooked. But they were there, and what they did mattered. This is One Shot at History. Sit back, pour yourself something, and let's get into it.
Join or die. No taxation without representation. Don't tread on me. Give me liberty or give me death. I did see this on a t-shirt recently, though. It said, Americans, we'll cross a frozen river to kill you in your sleep on Christmas. Not kidding, we've done it before. It's Christmas night, 1776. George Washington and about 2,400 frozen, half-starved soldiers are crossing an ice-choked Delaware River in the dead of night. Their mission? Surprise a garrison of Hessian mercenaries at Trenton, New Jersey. Now here's what the history books probably left out. If you dig up the musket balls at that battlefield today, and archaeologists actually have done that, more than half of them are .69 caliber. Not the British standard. Not the American-made standard. They are French. Those men crossing the Delaware that night were armed, in large part with weapons that had been smuggled across an ocean, laundered through a fake Spanish trading company, run through a Caribbean free port on a tiny Dutch island that most people never even heard of, and delivered to Washington's army in a covert supply operation so brazen it nearly caused an international incident. Before a single shot was fired at Concord, before the ink was dry on the Declaration of Independence, America's founders had already built one of the history's most sophisticated clandestine supply networks, part spy ring, part arms cartel, and part diplomatic con job. I'm Carl Reineman, and this is One Shot at History. Now, retrieving extra domestic weapons and technologies for the advancement of the United States has been around long before we scarfed up German scientists and V-2 rockets in World War II. And, if you believe it, some alien technology from Roswell in 1947. The U.S. has been doing this before we were the U.S. of A., and we haven't stopped. The United States government developed a robust tradition of consolidating surplus military hardware, domestic technologies that we somehow acquired, into centralized arsenals and research institutions. Beginning after the Revolutionary War, and then we took a huge leap following the Civil War. The War Department oversaw massive reabsorption of rifles, artillery, and ordnance from battlefields, channeling recovered materials into federal armories. This process wasn't merely logistical housekeeping. Engineers, ordnance officers, researchers studied these captured and recovered weapons to identify design improvements, metallurgical advances, and manufacturing efficiencies. The lessons drawn from the battlefield retrieval directly shaped the evolution of American arms doctrine and the standardization of military equipment heading into the industrial age. Today, we're going to take a dive into those hidden arsenals, the secret labs, the shadowy back channels, and the outright gun running that gave the Continental Army a fighting chance against the most powerful military on Earth. This is Steal, Smuggle, and Survive: How America Armed a Revolution. Now, before we go any further, I want to address that little hidden aspect in the closet. When most people think of spy, they think James Bond. You know, tuxedo, martini, Aston Martin, one-liner before the villain falls into the volcano. Or maybe you think Jason Bourne, the amnesiac assassin who parkoured his way through a European city and can kill you with a ballpoint pen. Or maybe you're thinking Jack Ryan, hunched over a CIA terminal at 2 a.m. cross-referencing satellite imagery and muttering darkly about geopolitical implications. The American Revolution gave us none of that. No Walther PPKs, no exploding pens, no Q branch. What it gave us instead was a French playwright who also happened to be an arms dealer. a Connecticut merchant who pretended not to speak French while negotiating with the French government, a doctor who invented chemically sophisticated invisible ink and labeled it medicine, and a New York housewife who ran a covert intelligence operation through her laundry line. These are not Bond villains. These are not even Bond. These are regular people doing over-the-top, extraordinary, completely insane things in the service of an idea that had never been tried before at this scale. Bond at least had the British government behind him, and in this episode, Britain is the Thanos to our Captain America. Jason Bourne has decades of Black Ops conditioning, and Jack Ryan has the full analytical resources of the CIA. The American founders had a printing press, some tobacco to barter with, and a desperate need for gunpowder. And they still pulled it off. If anything, that makes it more impressive. Ian Fleming had to invent a fictional spy to match what Benjamin Franklin was doing in his actual retirement years. So put on your tricorn hat, buckle up your woolen breeches, and straighten your waistcoat, because the real story of how America armed its revolution reads less like a history textbook and more like a screenplay that Hollywood reject for being too implausible. Now let's get into it. Let's start out with Washington's nightmare, and with a number, and that number is 90. 90 barrels of gunpowder. That's what George Washington found when he took command of the Continental Army in the summer of 1775, and ordered his officers to count every last barrel in the colony's magazines. 90 barrels for an army trying to fight the British Empire. One eyewitness recorded that upon hearing the number, Washington did not utter a word for a half an hour. Think about that. The general who had become the father of this nation stood in stunned, horrified silence for 30 minutes, because he could do the math. 90 barrels might be enough for one small engagement, but it was nothing close to what you needed to fight a war. To put it another way, if the Continental Army were a campfire, 90 barrels of gunpowder was enough to make s'mores, not even enough to burn down an empire. By January of 1776, Washington wrote in desperation to a trusted officer, and he said, "We are now without any money in our treasury, powder in our magazines, and arms in our stores." And here's the brutal irony. The colonies didn't just lack the gunpowder. They barely had the industrial infrastructure to make it. Gunpowder requires 3 ingredients: saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal. And America had almost no reliable saltpeter production. Britain had made absolutely sure of that. The Crown had a virtual monopoly on potassium nitrate, which is saltpeter, and the imports of it, deliberately keeping the colonies dependent on London for the stuff that makes the guns go bang. The core problem was colonial dependence. For generations, Britain had supplied its colonies with finished gunpowder and raw saltpeter imported primarily from India through the East India Company. The colonies had no meaningful domestic saltpeter industry of their own. There had never been a need to develop one under the umbrella of British imperial supply chains. But when that break came, that lifeline was severed overnight. So when the shooting started, the Continental Army was quite literally running on empty. Congress knew this couldn't stand. On September 18, 1775, they created what they called the Secret Committee. Not the Committee on Public Affairs, not the Office of War Supply, the Secret Committee. They weren't even subtle about it. In fairness, the committee for definitely not smuggling anything was probably already taken. This body was charged with one urgent mission: find guns, powder, and ammunition by any and all means necessary. Import them, buy them, smuggle them, just get them there. The committee was led by Benjamin Franklin, the most effective spy handler in American history. And their plan? They were going to go shopping in Europe, covertly, using fake companies, dummy merchants, and enough plausible deniability to keep France and Spain from getting dragged to an open war with Britain before the time was right. While Congress was laying the groundwork for covert foreign supply, Washington's commanders were pursuing a simpler, more direct solution to the weapons shortage. Take what you need from the enemy. From the very first days of the war, the Continental Army treated captured British arms, cannon, and ordnance not as battlefield trophies, but as critical military resources. They were cataloged, repaired, redistributed, and turned right back around against public enemy number one, the Crown. The most dramatic example happened just weeks after the first shots at Lexington and Concord. On May 10, 1775, Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys, a scrappy, ragtag Vermont militia, rode across Lake Champlain in the dead of night and stormed Fort Ticonderoga. The British garrison was small and caught completely off guard. Not a shot was fired. And when the sun came up, the Americans found themselves in possession of something quite extraordinary. Roughly 200 captured cannons, mortars, and artillery pieces, bronze guns, iron guns, sizes ranging from the light 3-pounders to the massive 24-pounders capable of reducing a ship or a fortification to splinters. It was the largest single cache of artillery in the entire continent of North America, and it had just changed hands in a single night's work. The problem, Washington needed those guns in Boston, over 300 miles away, in the dead of a New England brutal winter. Most of his officers said it was impossible. One man disagreed, Henry Knox. Henry was 25 years old, a former Boston bookseller with zero formal military training. He had essentially taught himself artillery tactics by reading every book on the subject he could find. And he was, in the most literal sense, a man who learned how to move 60 tons of cannon from a book. Washington, who had a gift for recognizing capable men, regardless of background, gave Knox the mission anyway and told him to spare no trouble and no expense. What followed became known as the Noble Train of Artillery, one of the most audacious feats of military logistics in American history. Knox selected 59 of the most serviceable guns, had them disassembled and loaded onto 42 specially built sleds, because they were going across the snow and ice in winter. They hitched those sleds to 80 yoke of oxen. Then his men dragged 60 tons of iron and bronze across frozen rivers, up and over the Berkshire Mountains, through forest tracks that barely qualified as roads. When the guns broke through the ice of the Hudson River, Knox stopped, ordered his men to pour water onto the surface overnight to refreeze it, thickening the ice just enough to bear the weight. Local communities along the routes, these new Americans, these farmers, these laborers, these ordinary colonists, saw the dilemma and they turned out to help, lending fresh animals and putting their own shoulders into hauling the guns up the steepest grades. Knox wrote in his diary that it seemed almost a miracle that they made it through. On the night of March 4th, 1776, Washington moved the Ticonderoga guns onto Dorchester Heights, the high ground overlooking Boston Harbor. When British General William Howe looked up the next morning and saw what had materialized overnight, he reportedly exclaimed that the Americans done more work in a single night than his entire army could have done in 3 months. He had no answer for it. And on March 17, 1776, 120 British ships carried 9,000 soldiers and over 1,000 loyalist civilians the hell out of Boston. The city was liberated, and it was liberated by captured British cannon hauled by American oxen across 300 miles of frozen wilderness by a bookseller who had never commanded a military operation in his entire life. Ticonderoga clearly was the biggest score, but it wasn't the only one. The Continental Congress, recognizing that battlefield capture was a practical supply strategy, went so far as to offer formal bounties for seized enemy artillery, paying hard coin to soldiers and naval crews who brought in British guns. These American privateers were essentially state-sanctioned pirates. They were soon hunting British supply ships specifically for their ordnance cargo. One of their most valuable early catches was the British ordnance brig Nancy, intercepted near Boston. Its hold contained small arms, flints, bayonets, shot, 13-inch brass mortars that Continental Army surgeons on the ship noted was more valuable than anything else they had on hand. Continental Army surgeon recorded at the time that had a British known just how few cannon the Americans actually possessed during the siege of Boston, the consequences would have been severe. Captured prizes were, quite literally, the only thing keeping the artillery situation from collapse. On land, the practice was just as systematic. After every significant engagement, Continental officers dispatched details of men to scour the battlefields for serviceable weapons, ammunition, and equipment. British Brown Bess muskets, Hessian pistols, powder horns, bayonets, cannonballs, all were collected, inventoried, and reissued. At the Battle of Bennington in 1777, American forces captured a trove of Hessian weapons, including dragoon pistols from the German mercenary units fighting for the crown. These were not stored as curiosities. These were cleaned, repaired, and put back into the hands of Continental soldiers who had nothing better on them. Even individual cannonballs were recovered mid-battle. Joseph Plum Martin described soldiers sprinting across a muddy parade ground after a battle, and sometimes in the midst of a battle, to grab spent British cannonballs because they got a ration of rum as a reward for each one retrieved. The surrender of General Burgoyne at Saratoga in October 1777 delivered the single largest battlefield windfall of the war, nearly 50 pieces of British artillery, along with thousands of muskets, tons of powder, and enough equipment to outfit multiple Continental regiments. Those captured guns were fed directly into the arsenals at Albany and Fishkill, cataloged by depot commanders and redistributed south to Washington's main force. The Continental Army was, in a very real sense, being armed by its own victories. This practice established something important that would echo through every American war that followed. The United States didn't just fight its enemies, it studied them. It stripped them and it absorbed what they had built. British bronze cannon informed American foundry techniques. Hessian firearms exposed American gunsmiths to German precision manufacturing. Captured naval ordnance ended up in coastal fortifications. The battlefield was a classroom, and the tuition was paid in iron and blood. By the time the war ended, American arsenals contained a genuinely international collection of hardware. French, British, German, Dutch, and the engineers and armorers who maintained it had learned something from every single piece. The habit of mind was take it apart, figure out how it works, and make it better. It would become one of the defining traits of the American military-industrial character. I want you to picture the perfect spy. Smooth, clever, well-connected, moves in the highest circles, and he knows how to lie with a smile. Now, picture Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais, a watchmaker's son. He's a court musician. He's a playwright. And now he's a secret agent and an arms dealer. And the man who more than almost anyone else kept the American Revolution alive in its most desperate early years. Beauchamp is best known today as the author of The Barber of Seville, The Marriage of Figaro, the plays that would later become world-famous operas. But before he was a celebrated playwright, he was something far more interesting. He was a fixer for the French crown, a man who could be sent on delicate missions that required both brilliance and total discretion. By the mid-1770s, France was absolutely burning for revenge against Britain. The 7 Years' War, or what we Americans call the French and Indian War, had ended in the utter humiliation for France in 1763. They'd lost Canada. They'd lost all their American colonial empire. French Foreign Minister, the Comte de Vergennes, literally said out loud that England was the natural enemy of France, and he was not speaking diplomatically. So when American colonists started making noise about independence, Vergennes and King Louis XVI saw their opportunity. But they had a problem. They couldn't be seen openly backing a rebellion against a fellow monarchy. If they helped America too brazenly, it might encourage their own subjects to revolt against them. They needed plausible deniability. Enter Beaumarchais. In 1776, Louis XVI authorized the expenditure of 1 million livres. Historians like me estimate nowadays that's somewhere in the range of several $1,000,000 to secretly fund American war supply. Spain's King Carlos III matched it with another million. 2 million livres channeled through a single front organization. Beaumarchais created a fake company with a wonderfully theatrical name, Rodrigue Hortalais à Compagnie. The name was deliberately chosen to sound Spanish, high-sounding, fictitious, and utterly untraceable to either the French or Spanish governments. He registered it covertly and made sure there was no paper trail connecting it to Versailles. On the surface, Rodrigue Hortalais was a legitimate import-export trading firm. In reality, it was a state-sponsored gun-running operation with the most famous playwright at the helm. The cover story was elegant. America would ship tobacco, indigo, and other goods to France in exchange for military supplies, designed to look like ordinary trade. The French government would wink very hard, as one contemporary put it, when Beaumarchais was quietly loading surplus cannons and muskets onto the ships in French ports. But Beaumarchais needed an American contact, someone he could deal with directly. And in March of 1776, Congress provided one, Silas Deane of Connecticut. Deane is one of the great forgotten heroes of the Revolution. In March 1776, the Committee of Secret Correspondence gave him what might be the strangest job description in American political history. He was to travel to France alone, officially as a private merchant, was not allowed to speak French, even though he understood it and could speak it. He had no diplomatic training. He's never even traveled beyond Philadelphia, and without a single official credential. His mission was to somehow procure arms, uniforms, and equipment for an army of 25,000 men. It was essentially a LinkedIn job posting that read, 0 qualifications required, must save civilization, unpaid, no references accepted. He later wrote to his wife acknowledging that he seemed an odd choice. No kidding. He had no diplomatic training, but he went anyway. Deane arrived in Paris in June of 1776 and quickly made contact with Vergennes and Beaumarchais. Together, they set the Rodrigue Hortalais machine in motion, and they moved fast. By early 1777, Beaumarchais had arranged cargoes for over 40 ships. The first to arrive was the Mercure, which pulled into Portsmouth, New Hampshire in mid-March 1777 after 7 weeks at sea. Its hold contained enough arms, uniforms, equipment, and precious brass cannon to help equip a substantial force. Muskets and gunpowder were distributed to militias in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. By the end of 1777, France had smuggled roughly 2 million pounds of gunpowder and around 60,000 French arms into the colonies. To put that in perspective, that's roughly 1 musket for every soldier in the Continental Army. And those shipments, they were the crucial difference at Saratoga in October 1777, the battle that changed everything, the battle that finally convinced France to openly ally with America. Now let's talk about the Golden Rock. If Rodrigue Hortalais was the sophisticated end of the supply operation, there was a rougher, more chaotic, and frankly more entertaining side running in parallel. and it's centered on a tiny volcanic rock in the Dutch Caribbean that most people have never heard of. St. Eustatius, or Statia to the locals. 8 square miles of rock and scrub brush in the Lesser Antilles. Today it's home to about 3,000 people, and it's a modest dive tourism industry. In the 1770s, it was the most important free port in the Western Hemisphere, and the busiest hub of illegal arms trafficking in the world. Basically, if the 18th century Caribbean had a Craigslist, Statia was the free stuff section. Except the free stuff was canon and nothing was actually free. Everything had a price. The Dutch called it the Gouden Rots, or the Golden Rock, and they weren't wrong. And at its peak, the harbor at St. Eustatius was handling thousands of transactions a month. You could buy anything there: sugar, molasses, tea, slaves, rum. And if you knew how to ask, barrels of gunpowder quietly labeled as rice, salt, or sugar. The Dutch Republic was officially neutral, but Dutch merchants were not stupid. They could see which way the wind was blowing, and there was an absolute fortune to be made supplying both sides. Dutch gunpowder producers ramped up production dramatically. Between 1776 and 1779, one Dutch province alone nearly doubled its gunpowder output, and most of it flowed right through Statia. Here's how the operation worked. French and Dutch suppliers loaded ships with gunpowder, often packed in barrels marked as tea, rice, maybe molasses, to fool British inspectors. Those ships sailed to St. Eustatius. American smuggling vessels, many of them experienced blockade runners from the New England ports, would rendezvous at Statia, pay in tobacco, and if they had it, hard coin, and then slip back toward the American coast, dodging naval British patrols. We estimate that as much as half of all Revolutionary War military supplies were transshipped through Eustatius. Half, from an island the size of a small city park. Here's a remarkable moment you may never have heard of. On November 16, 1776, an American naval brig called the U.S. Andrew Doria sailed into the harbor at St. Eustatius. And as appropriate, its captain fired a 9-gun salute, the traditional naval greeting, and the Dutch governor, Johannes de Graaf, ordered Port Orange to fire back. That return salute from a Dutch fort was the first time in history that any foreign government officially acknowledged the flag of the United States. Britain was pissed. They were furious, not just angry. This is the kind of outrage that leads to huge international incidents. The British ambassador demanded the governor's removal. De Graaf was recalled to Holland. The tension eventually helped push the Dutch Republic into an open war with Britain in 1780. And in 1781, British Admiral George Rodney sailed into Statia's harbor with a fleet. He captured it by surprise and found, and I am quoting historical records here, warehouses, quote, filled to the brim, unquote, with military supplies destined for America. Several thousand tons of cordage, dozens of American ships loaded with tobacco, and vast quantities of arms. The British made off with supplies valued at over £500,000 sterling. Rodney himself was accused of enriching himself personally on the plunder, and it was just another scandal on top of a scandal. But by then, it didn't matter. The damage, or rather, the help, had already been done. America had its gunpowder. Now, while all the arms smuggling was going on, Washington was running a parallel operation in intelligence, and it involved some genuinely cutting-edge technology for the era. George Washington is remembered as a general and a statesman. What he doesn't always get credit for is being one of the most sophisticated intelligence officers in American history. From the very beginning of the war, Washington understood that information is just as valuable as gunpowder, and far harder for the British to interdict. He wasn't naive about it. He recruited spies. He established protocols developed counterintelligence operations to feed British false information, and oversaw the creation of some remarkably advanced communication technology. That is, for the 18th century, at least. Now let me introduce you to Sir James J. Not the famous James J. This is his brother, a physician who had been practicing medicine in England and who, in 1775, developed what Washington would call a sympathetic stain, an invisible ink so advanced that even today chemists consider it genuinely sophisticated achievement for its era. James J. is one of those people history keeps in the waiting room while his more famous siblings gets called into the exam. But on this particular day, James had the better trick up his sleeve, or rather, the better liquid in his vial. J's ink was based on galotanic acid, the same compound found in oak galls. The magic of it was that it wasn't just hard to see, it was chemically engineered to be unrevealable without a specific counterpart reagent. The common tricks of the day, which were holding paper near a candle to reveal lemon juice or milk, or other old invisible ink tricks, would do nothing to J's compound. You had to have the matching reagent to develop it. Washington was almost giddy about this. In a letter to one of his officers, he wrote, and I love this quote, "It is in my power, I believe, to procure a liquid which nothing but a counter liquor rubbed over the paper afterwards can make legible. Fire, which will bring lime juice, milk, and other things of this kind to light, has no effect on it." Unquote. In other words, the old British tricks won't work. You can't hold it over a candle all day, you'll get nothing, and this was state of the art. The ink was shipped to Washington disguised as medical supplies. Vials of medicine, the code word for the invisible ink in all subsequent correspondence, was, quote, medicine. Had anyone intercepted the shipment, it would have looked like any other physician's supplies. Even the packaging was cover. Washington deployed this technology most famously through the Culper spy ring, a network of civilian and military operatives working behind British lines in occupied New York, starting in 1778. Now, some of you may have watched the television series Turn, which deeply focused on the Culper spy ring. While the television series took a lot of, let's just call them liberties, it did tell the story pretty well of the Culper ring. I'll just give you a synopsis here. The ring was organized by Major Benjamin Talmadge and used a chain of remarkable agents. Abraham Woodhull, a farmer on Long Island who went by the codename Samuel Culper. Robert Townsend, a Manhattan merchant who wrote pro-British articles for a Tory newspaper while secretly feeding intelligence to Washington, one of the earliest known uses of journalistic cover for espionage. Caleb Brewster, who rowed across Long Island Sound in whaleboats to carry messages. There was Anna Strong, who used the laundry on her clothesline, her actual laundry, as a signal system, with a black petticoat indicating a dead drop location and handkerchief signaling which cove Brewster would use to pick up that dead drop message. Think about it for a second. British soldiers saw laundry. Anna Strong saw the operational intelligence. And that is, hands down, the most extraordinary use of domestic chores in the history of warfare. Talmadge also devised a numerical cipher system encoding words, locations, and people as 3-digit numbers based on their position in a popular dictionary of the day. George Washington himself was listed as 711. The procedure for a Culper letter was a layered genius. An agent would first write an innocent, mundane letter in ordinary ink, discussing business, the weather, family matters, and then in the blank spaces between the lines, using J's invisible ink, they would write the actual intelligence, reports on British troop movements, ship counts, supply information, battle plans. And to add another layer, some reports were embedded in letters addressed to known Tory loyalists, because British soldiers would be less likely to closely inspect mail going to loyalist households. The system was extraordinary. The British never broke it. The Culper ring operated for the entire duration of the war without losing a single agent to capture. Now let's talk about the guns. The Pennsylvania long rifle. Talking about this weapon, this is a homegrown American technological achievement that genuinely shocked British soldiers and helped rewrite the rules of warfare. The Pennsylvania long rifle, sometimes called the Kentucky rifle, is the product of German and Swiss immigrant gunsmiths who settled in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania in the early 1700s. They brought with them the tradition of the Jaeger rifle, the precision hunting rifle of the European forest, and they adapted it for the American frontier. What they created was something that had no real equivalent in the 18th century European battlefield. The long rifle had a grooved barrel that imparted a spin to the bullet, stabilizing its flight in a way that smoothbore muskets simply couldn't match. Its effective accurate range was around 300 yards. The standard British Brown Bess musket was accurate on a good day to maybe 80, maybe 100 yards. Think about that and let it sink in. The American rifleman could accurately hit targets from 3 times further away than the British could shoot back. To use a modern analogy, it's the difference between a sniper rifle and a super soaker, except the super soaker is the one of the most powerful military on the earth is carrying. The psychological effect was immense. A British major at one point wrote home about the American riflemen. He said, "The redcoats are so amazingly terrified by our own riflemen that they will not stir behind their lines." They were afraid to leave their own camp. Professional soldiers, trained by the greatest military power on earth, pinned down by farmers in fringed leather jackets. The British Army had conquered much of the known world. They were not prepared for this in our American ingenuity. In the early days of the Siege of Boston, American sharpshooters took up positions and began picking off British officers with a selectivity and precision that had never been seen in European warfare. Officers started wearing plain clothes. They stopped carrying their swords in public. The rituals of military command, riding in front, distinguishing yourself visually from your men, suddenly became suicidal. And in a war where looking important could get you killed, the British officer class discovered the tactical advantage to looking absolutely unremarkable. It was fashion forward in a grim sort of way. Now, in fairness, the long rifle was not a perfect weapon, and it was not a magic solution. It did have real drawbacks. First, it was slow to reload. Loading a long rifle could take a minute or more, far slower than an experienced musketeer who could fire 3 or 4 rounds a minute. In a pitched battle, when the enemy was charging with fixed bayonets, a rifleman who had just fired was in serious trouble. Turns out, quote, "I just need another 60 seconds, quote, is not a great thing to say when a line of angry redcoats is 40 yards away and closing. Second, it could not be fitted with a bayonet. The rifle's muzzle was the wrong shape and caliber. So when the British infantry charged, riflemen had to run or die. At Freeman's Farm during the Saratoga campaign, Morgan's riflemen shot down nearly every British officer in the advancing column. Then they had to break and run when the main body counterattacked with bayonets. Washington himself understood this. He argued for a limited, specialized role for rifle companies, as skirmishers, as snipers, and as disruptors, not as the main battle line. The rifle was a tactical weapon, not a strategic replacement for the musket. The truly decisive weapon of the war was still the French Charvel musket that Beaumarchais had been smuggling across the Atlantic. But the rifle mattered. At Saratoga, Morgan's riflemen specifically targeted those British officers and the famous General Simon Fraser. Fraser's death broke British morale at a critical moment. The long rifle did what nothing else in American arsenal could do. It reached out and touched an enemy commander from a distance that no British weapon could answer. I want to close our main story with something I think is important, as a reminder that behind all the swashbuckling intrigue and covert operations, there were real human costs. Silas Deane did more to arm the Continental Army than almost any other individual. He was the first American diplomatic envoy ever dispatched abroad. Ever. He procured and shipped arms valued at more than 6 million livres. The muskets and powder that arrived in Portsmouth in March of 1777 were directly responsible for Washington's ability to fight at Saratoga. And Saratoga was the battle that convinced France to formally ally with America. In other words, no Silas Deane, very possibly no French alliance, and without the French alliance, the revolution probably fails. And yet, Deane came home in 1778 to find himself the center of a vicious political scandal. His rivals in Congress, particularly Arthur Lee, who was a paranoid, jealous, and politically connected member, accused him of misusing funds and enriching himself through the supply contracts. Deane couldn't properly defend himself because his account books were in Paris, and the French government refused to release them, not wanting to expose the details of their covert pre-alliance operations. Deane spent years trying to clear his name, but he couldn't. Despairing and bitter, he returned to Europe. Letters he wrote privately, questioning whether independence had truly been worth the cost, were intercepted by British intelligence and published in a loyalist newspaper. Deane was denounced as a traitor. In 1789, finally ready to return to America after years of exile, Deane boarded a ship. Deane died within hours of departure, under mysterious circumstances that have never been fully explained. Some historians believe he was poisoned on board by a British agent. Some believe he took his own life. The official record is ambiguous. And it wasn't until 1841, more than 50 years after his death, that Congress officially exonerated Silas Deane and compensated his family. Better late than never? I suppose. But Deane never got to hear it. Congress waited a half a century to say, "Our bad." The man who arguably made the French alliance possible died in exile, broke and disgraced. If there's a hall of fame for people in history forgot to thank, Silas Deane is the first on the ballot. Let's zoom out for a moment. I think it's worth considering what all this adds up to. The American Revolution is taught as a story of muskets and marches, of Minutemen on village greens, of Washington crossing the Delaware. And those things are real, and they are important, but there's a whole shadow of history running underneath that very story. A history of covert operations, secret committees, fake companies, smuggling networks, spies, and technological ingenuity that made all those battles possible. Again, before there was a Declaration of Independence, there was a Committee of Secret Correspondence. Before there was a Franco-American alliance, there was Rodrigue Horteliz et Compagnie. Before there was Saratoga, there were those ships pulling into Portsmouth Harbor with smuggled French muskets in their holds. The founders weren't just idealists writing beautiful documents about liberty. They were also pragmatic, they were ruthless, and creative operators who understood that ideals need steel behind them. They lied to the British, they laundered money through fake trading companies, they used a Caribbean free port to run an international arms network. They deployed invisible ink, numerical ciphers, and they used clothesline signals. They recruited a French playwright to be their chief arms dealer, and they did it all while simultaneously trying to manage a conventional war against the world's greatest military power. And that, to me, is every bit as impressive as the Battle of Bunker Hill, and maybe even more so. If you enjoyed today's episode, I'd ask you to share it with anyone you know who loves history, especially the hidden, messy humankind that doesn't always make the textbooks. I'm Carl Reineman, and you've been listening to One Shot at History. Thanks for being here. Please like and share our podcast.